So today I want to talk about the industrialization or the industrialization period, uh, immigration, and the progressive. We're not necessarily going to talk about all three of those things, but this section is pretty much broken down into those three categories, and I'm going to try to kind of one of them off at a time, and that might mean we spend 3 days. It might mean we do it all in one. It kind of depends. All right, and they're all kind of tied together. Especially industrialization and immigration. Progressive era comes after, and we'll talk about that more specifically, but especially industrialization and immigration kind of are interconnected in terms of their significance and also the timing. So we're kind of going in a linear, from the beginning of the United States through time, but it's not perfect. We kind of jump around. And so don't necessarily take this to assume that whatever we're talking about today is always going to be after whatever I talked about. Right? In general, that's the case, but not always. So let me backtrack just a couple slides. I'm going to skip over some of this stuff, but for those of you that were here in class yesterday, this is kind of where we ended. We talked about the Reformation or the Reconstruction of the South, which was after the Civil War. The South was in ruins, and kind of the process of putting the South back together and essentially reuniting the nation. And that took 10, 12 years. Okay, so the period we're going to talk about now is kind of late 1800s, but some of this is going to overlap, right? So in general, Civil War ends. And what we have after that is this massive, massive period of growth. Okay, so our country had been growing in both population and in terms of business, like businesses and factories have been steadily increasing since the late 1700s, right? So at this point, 60, 70, 80 years, right? There's been this kind of slow progression of population getting bigger and bigger, and businesses and factories kind of getting more powerful and bigger, right? But all of a sudden, when the Civil War ends, there's this massive boom in population and industry, okay? And the two things obviously go together in terms of they impact one another, right? Part of the reason for that boom was the birth of the railroad system. Right? So there were railroads already, right, prior to the Civil War. But you really see a massive, massive increase in the amount of railroad networks or the mileage of railroads, right? So, it's like, think of roads, right? If there's one road to get somewhere, right, then a few people are going to travel that road. But if there's 10 different ways to get to that one place, then all of a sudden people can start coming from everywhere. Right? And things start to become more interconnected. Same thing with railroad. So what you have happen is all of these people are filling the land in the West, moving west in huge numbers. Okay? And also, they're discovering huge quantities of natural resources, metals, right? Silver, copper, iron, right? All those things, right? Gold. And that contributes to some of this growth as well, because we have this giant supply of natural resources that's impacting the economy, but also, from a practical standpoint, especially when it comes to steel, right? Iron is not discovered, but huge quantities of iron are cultivated from the West. And that allows the steel industry to really boom, which in turn leads to more and more railroads, bigger and bigger buildings, and so on and so forth. So I just kind of wanted to lay that out there. We talked a little bit about the Indians or the Native Americans and kind of the conflict between settlers and Native Americans. So we're not going to talk about that today. So back to kind of my point of what I wanted to talk about is industrialization. Okay, so industrialization And again, I don't have a very good slide. I need to go through and actually redo these slides. Sorry, I'm kind of talking. Let me pull up. I know it's not as exciting as my PowerPoint, and I know my PowerPoint's not that exciting, so I understand that. But let me just pull up this because there is some good information on here, and I'm just going to pull stuff out of here. You don't need to read it verbatim, but I just want to use this as kind of a guide to make sure I'm talking about some stuff that's important. So this period of industrialization is basically referred to as when we go from primarily an agricultural-based economy, primarily an industry-based. And what I mean by that is prior to 1860, there's not like a definite line, but before this boom, America was primarily a farming country. In other words, most of the economy was based around agriculture. Now, throughout the 1800s, that had slowly started to shift. But it wasn't until this period after the Civil War that it went from this to this, right? An exponential growth. And so, again, as it says here, some of the reasons were the US gained plentiful natural resources, which we talked about. And those led to the manufacture of new products, new machines that made things more efficient. Also, the discovery of huge quantities of fuel, so oil, gas, coal, that were needed to power these machines. So those two things go hand in hand. There's lots of resources to build these new machines, and there's also a lot of fuel to power these new machines, right? Whereas before, that wasn't necessarily the case. We didn't have that many resources, which meant we didn't have very many machines, and we didn't have a huge supply of fuel, which meant we had to use it sparingly. Now, when we discover we have, not an unlimited, but a huge amount of fuel sources in terms of gas, oil, and coal, we started to use them. We started to use them a lot. So another reason for this kind of rapid industrialization or this rapid boom in industry is invention. And we're going to talk about some of the things that came about in this period of time. And these new inventions, whether they were actual machines or whether they were new processes or processes that came about making things more efficient, all of these things led to the ability for goods to be produced more easily, which meant more efficiently, you could make more of them, and also less expensively. So you could make a lot of stuff cheap and sell a ton of it. And so that revelation really changed the dynamic of the economy in the United States. Now, the other thing about this, and this again is what we'll get to when we talk about immigration, is along with all of this new technology, all of these new resources, we also had a boom in immigration or people moving to the United States. So between 1860 and 1900, those last 40 years of this century, right, we doubled our population from where it was. So from the Civil War to 1900, essentially the United States doubled in population, like that. And that, again, led to more and more jobs, more and more demand for products. So you have this giant, just explosion of cities, places like New York, Boston, Pittsburgh, Philadelphia, mostly East Coast cities, that were big cities by 1860 standards, but small compared to what we think of them as today, to all of a sudden becoming these mega urban centers, right? And so that big shift was a complete 180 from where we were before. So let me go back to my PowerPoint slide. So sorry for all my hopping around. All right, so back to my slideshow. So I don't know why this, we talked about that stuff. All right, this is what I want to talk about. So some of the new technologies that came about. So again, some of these happened before the Civil War, but it wasn't really until the later 1800s that some of these new technologies really were implemented and began changing the way that Americans made things. So we have the invention of the assembly line, which seems silly, but when you think about it, right, if one person sits down to make, and the example here is guns, the cotton gin, which could take cotton and process it way quicker than just doing it by hand, and then also automobiles, which would come later, right? But the assembly line, or the idea behind it, would be that there would be a literal line of people, and each person would do a different process along the assembly of that thing. So take guns. Rather than having a gunsmith sit down and make an entire gun by themselves, they started to realize, wow, we can do this a lot faster if we have a gun that's basically on a table or a conveyor belt or whatever it is, and one person does one part of the assembly, and then they pass it on to the next person, and that person does the next part, and they pass it on, and then guns just keep coming down the line, and that person just does the same task over and over and over again, which sounds boring. But from an efficiency standpoint, think about how much more you can make. You can make a ton more, which is exactly why when Henry Ford did this with cars, cars went from being something so expensive and so rare that almost no one could afford. When he was able to produce a ton of cars with very low cost, guess what happened? Everybody could afford a car. Or not everybody, but you get what I'm saying, right? The vast majority of people could afford a car. And it happened quickly. It was like one day, only the super wealthy elites had cars. The next day, everyone had a car. So it was a major shift. We had the technology, or we had some of the other things. We had steam engines, which weren't a thing until then, which also powered factories. So with steam engines, they powered factories, and they also powered things like boats and trains. And so before that, you couldn't really get around, and factories couldn't really produce much. But then in the late 1800s, down here, kind of the big thing that happened was they figured out a better and faster way to mass produce steel. And I won't go into kind of the details of it, but it's known as the Bessemer process. And it was really the first time that people figured out how to mass produce steel. And again, like I said, that led to a boom in railroads, skyscrapers, and the growth of cities. Because if you can build steel and you can build it affordably and in mass quantity, you're going to have lots of material to build with. And then we have this huge influx of people, not just to the United States, but more specifically to the city. So before this industrial boom, the majority of people lived in rural areas. There were cities still, but the majority of people that lived in cities was low, or not the majority. The percentage of Americans that lived in cities was relatively low compared to in rural areas. But because all of this technology was creating new jobs and cities were becoming bigger and more efficient, people moved to where the jobs were. And so you start to get these massive cities, and you start to see the trend we see today, where more and more people live in cities, right? As opposed to in rural areas. Now, there were problems that came from that down here, like low wages, long hours, no benefits, child labor, poor sanitation, and we can go on and on. That's where progressive era comes in. We talk about progressive politics and changing some of those things. So again, I'll see if we get there, but if we don't get there, we'll talk about it tomorrow. Okay, so That's industrialization. Now let's look at the other part of that boom, which is immigration. So here's a little graph. Okay, so let me take a look at these lines. So we have the blue line, which is immigrants from Northern and Western Europe. So, and again, this is all the way from 1870 to 1920. All right. So this period of industrialization isn't like a definitive from here to here. It's kind of this whole general area of late 1800s, early 1900s. So in the early 1800s, we see a big spike in immigrants from Western Europe. And a lot of these immigrants were Irish because of the potato famine in Ireland. So, and that's why you see this sharp spike that happens in only a 5-year period, and then it dies down again. And this peak is almost 600,000 people. So this is 1 million people. And this is immigration to the United States by year. Then you see later on, this red line is Southern and Eastern Europe. So Italians, Russians, Jews, and they don't really start immigrating in mass numbers until around the turn of the century. And then they come over in huge amounts, almost 1 million people per year. So that's doing a lot, changing the dynamics of what the United States looks like. Right? And then this last bar down here is Asian, African, and the Americas, so like Latin America. Okay? And you can see it stays relatively low until even later, in between 1910 and 1915. The point of this isn't to necessarily show you specifically all these people are coming and why they were coming or who they were. The bigger takeaway is just to consider, because the United States was essentially always an immigrant country, because we were founded by people that moved over from Europe to begin with. But the way our country starts to change dramatically in this period of industrialization, to look more diverse. And as a part of that, you start to see a rise in nativism or discrimination against immigrants, which seems counterintuitive thinking about America being a country of immigrants, right? Everyone was an immigrant in America at some point. But a lot of people had ties back to the very beginning of our country or even maybe the colonies. And so they started to feel like it was their country. And so when these masses and masses of new immigrants started to come over, they started to be discriminated. Okay. This map here is essentially showing, and sorry, it's kind of blurry. It's essentially showing the same thing, right? It breaks it down over even a larger time frame, and it doesn't necessarily say, it doesn't take into account those peaks and valleys that the last chart did, where it's showing specifically what years. This is just a big picture showing you how many people immigrated to the United States in this 80-year time frame, right? We have almost 2 million from Canada, 800,000 from Asia, 230,000 from Mexico, and then you see the really big numbers from people from Europe, right? You see almost 2 million from Scandinavia, 3 million from Russia, almost 8 million from Great Britain and Ireland, 5.5 million from Germany, 4 million from Italy, 6 million from other European countries. And so my point is, this is just a huge influx of people to a country that prior to this wasn't particularly big. So again, driving home the point maybe a little too much, but there were lots of benefits from that, and then it also created a lot of issues, just from logistical standpoint of having a country that wasn't really populated and spread out to a country that was becoming more and more densely populated and greater, and with a much greater population. So you had these two major hubs for immigration. Maybe you heard of them, maybe you haven't, that's okay. Ellis Island, New York, Angel Island and San Francisco, and these are where essentially all immigrants during this period were coming into. So obviously Ellis Island being in New York received the bulk of the European immigrants. Angel Island being in California received a bulk of the Asian immigrants. I'm oversimplifying it, but you kind of get the main idea. So we're not going to go into specific detail about muckrakers and all of this, but when we start to get, let's actually do some practice questions. I'm going to save the progressive era part for tomorrow. So I don't want to start it and then run out of time. So let's stop the PowerPoint there and just look at a couple practice questions that I have lined up that talk about industrialization and immigration. And then tomorrow we will finish up this document. So go down here, and we're going to kind of pick through some of these. So we're going to do these first two, and then we're going to skip 3 and 4 and save those for tomorrow. So let's look at number 1. Number 1 says, which of the following always occurs during a period of rapid industrialization? The annexation of a new territory, an increase in manufacturing, an increase in population, or an increase in immigration. All right, so this is just essentially a reading question or a vocab question. All right. All of those things could be associated with industrialization. But the key word here is, which of the following always? In other words, not some of the time, not most of the time, which of these always occurs during a period of industrialization? Remember, industrialization is an increase in industry, right? Businesses and factories. Okay, so the one that seems to stand out away from the other 3 is A, right? The other 3 are similar in terms of just the way they're worded. Increase in blank, increase in blank, and increase. A, the annexation of new territory. Even if you don't know what annexation means, it doesn't seem to fit, and new territory doesn't seem to fall in line with anything we talked about in terms of industrialization. So A is the easy one to kind of get rid of. Let's look at these other 3. An increase in manufacturing, an increase in population, and an increase in immigration. Now, we just talked about the industrial period in the United States, and all 3 of those things happen, right? We know that. We talked about it probably longer than you wanted to hear me go on about it. But we know those 3 things happen. The key is, think about industrialization in general, not specific to in the United States or specific to what we talked about, but just industrialization, plain and simple. By definition, only one of those things has to happen. Can you figure out which one it is? Well, it's not an increase in immigration. Now, that did happen in the United States, and it probably usually happens, but it doesn't have to, because industrialization isn't defined as a period of increased immigration. It's defined as an increase in industry. Same with population. An increase in population usually occurs along with industrialization, but doesn't have to. By definition, the only one that has to happen is an increase in manufacturing. In other words, making stuff. If there's an increase in industry, then there's an increase in making stuff. B is your answer. Hopefully that makes some sense. So let's look at number 2. I feel like I'm starting to go slightly crazy talking to myself all day, every day. One day I'll be able to see your faces again and have normal class, but until then, I'm just going to have to hope I don't go too crazy. All right, so number 2. Which event directly contributed to the growth of American industries in the mid-1800s? All right, So let's read through these. The tricky part about this question is the answers are gonna sound like things you don't know about, and that's okay. Well, that's how the question is supposed to be set up that way. Try to fool you into thinking it's a harder question than it is. So which of these directly contributed to the growth of industry? A, passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigration. B, the passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which helped prevent businesses from forming monopolies. C, the development of the Bessemer process, which made it easier to produce steel. Or D, the development of settlement houses to aid impoverished immigrants in cities. Okay, so notice, even if you don't know what any of those things are, each one of them explains exactly what that thing is. And so you don't have to know what the Chinese Exclusion Act is, or the Sherman Antitrust Act is, or the Bessemer process, or settlement house. They tell you. They tell you all you need to know. So, which of these seems like it's something that is helping industry as opposed to the opposite? Okay. Well, the first one that I would get rid of is A, the passage of the Chinese Exclusion Act, which banned Chinese immigration. Okay, so first of all, banning immigration, or in other words, telling immigrants they can't come to the United States, that's doing the opposite of growing industry, because if you let more people come over, then you're going to have more workers, and that should contribute to more industry. But banning Chinese immigration is something that would be limited. It would be doing the opposite. Just by the way it's worded, makes me feel like it's not a good option. So I would get rid of it. B is a little confusing if you don't know what some of those words mean. So I'm just going to skip it and say, let's not get rid of it for now. C, making steel easier to produce. Okay, same thing, I'm going to leave it. D would be the other one I'd get rid of. The development of settlement houses to aid impoverished immigrants in cities. That's great, and that is an important thing, and it helped those immigrants, and it helped those lower class workers in cities. But from a growth of industry standpoint, it's not something that directly contributed. It may have helped indirectly, right? But the development of city houses isn't something, or settlement houses, isn't something that directly contributed to it. So it's going to be B or it's going to be C. Passage of the Sherman Antitrust Act, which helped prevent businesses from forming monopolies, or C, the development of the Bessemer process, which made it easier to produce steel. So if you don't know some of that vocab, what I would say is, what is the general tone of B and what is the general tone of C? And what I mean by that is, B says, whatever this thing is, the Sherman Antitrust Act, it was preventing businesses from something, right? So even if you don't know what monopolies are or what the heck the Sherman Antitrust Act is, just from going on words alone and the kind of tone of the answer, B is something that is preventing something from happening. Okay? That to me isn't growing industry. Whereas C, the way it's written, the development of the Bessemer process, which made it easier to produce steel. Making something easier should be growing industry. Right? And so even if I maybe don't know exactly what B and C are saying, I'm going to go with C because it just makes the most sense. And C is correct. And to explain further what B is, because I want you to actually know some stuff as opposed to just being able to guess. But B is saying if businesses get too big and powerful, in other words, if they control one aspect of the economy, then they are deemed a monopoly and they get broken apart to kind of give other businesses a chance. You could argue that allowing monopolies grows industry, or you could argue the other way. But the question asks which directly. And so the only one that's directly contributing is making steel cheaper and easier. And see the answer there. All right, so we'll do the rest of these questions tomorrow. So let's stop there for the day, and I'll pick up right where we left off. Sound good? Okay. Thank you, everyone. I will either see you back this afternoon for science or hopefully again tomorrow for some social studies. Have a good one.